Good morning, guys. My name is Emiliana Rodriguez, and I'm going to be talking about Robert Berdella. Robert Berdella was born on January 31st, 1949. He was raised Catholic. His father was a die setter, and his mother was a homemaker. At the age of 16, his father had died, and shortly after, his mother remarried. Berdella had a lot of anger and resentment when this occurred. While in grade school, Berdella performed very well, although many teachers found him hard to teach, and he was actually bullied by other kids due to his appearance. Around the same time that his father had died, Berdella had also claimed that he was sexually assaulted by a male co-worker at a restaurant that he had worked at. Another event that occurred was his viewing of the adaptation of The Collector. Berdella has stated that this movie left a lasting impression on him. In this movie, the protagonist actually kidnaps a woman and imprisons her, which we'll actually see is one of the things that Berdella chose to do with his victims. Berdella had enrolled in the Kansas City Art Institute. Here, it is believed that he engaged in animal torture at least 3 times, and he began using alcohol and selling drugs. In 1969, he was expelled from the college after killing a dog for the sake of art. After being expelled, he became a chef. And at the age of 32, he quit being a chef and opened up his own store called Bob's Bazaar. At the same time, Robert Berdella came out as being gay and actually had a short relationship with a Vietnam vet. After this relationship had ended, he had started spending time with many male prostitutes. His goal was to befriend them and then try to get them out of prostitution. Berdella's modus operandi involved the following. He would first lure the victims to his home. Most of his victims he had known previously through his work of befriending prostitutes and trying to get them out of prostitution. So it wasn't very difficult to lure them to his home. Once they were in his home, he would then sedate them with animal anesthetics or tranquilizers that he had gotten from a veterinary supply house. He would also place drugs into their food, or give them other sedatives, stating to the prostitute or potential victim that they were vitamins, aspirin, or other recreational drugs. Once the victims were passed out, he would then restrain them with ropes, gags, and a dog collar, and then he would hold them in his basement. While in his basement, Berdella would then torture and rape his victims. His methods of torture included injecting their vocal cords with drain cleaner by pouring them down their throats. He would probe his fingers into their eyes. He would also apply some chemicals such as bleach to their eyes with cotton swabs. In other instances, he also filled their ears with bathtub caulking. In addition to this, he would also use electrical shocks to torture them. He would also sometimes beat them with a rubber mallet. He would also stick them with needles and pounded their limbs with boards, sticks, and other heavy objects. When raping his victims, he sometimes would also use parts of his body to sodomize them and would also use other objects. Not all of his victims died from asphyxiation. When he did choose to use asphyxiation to kill them, it was mostly because he felt he was about to be found out, and so it was a quick way to prevent that from happening. Other deaths were caused by medical complications such as overdoses, infections, and head injuries. The motives behind Berdella's crimes were control and ownership. The seek for control, Berdella would set the goal of breaking the will and spirit of the men that he had captured in his basement. This was done by having them restrained and the repeated torture. After this, he would seek to have some type of ownership over them. The way he wanted it to be was that he could completely control the actions of his victims, and that would eventually lead to him getting them to a state to where they were like a live sex doll. And his dream was to own a doll-like sex doll. Obviously not. His first victim was in 1984. His name was Jerry Howell. Jerry Howell was a prostitute that Berdella held in his basement. Berdella repeatedly tortured and raped him and then asphyxiated him. In 1985, Berdella then had Robert Sheldon as his victim. He had convinced Robert Sheldon to stay with him for a few days. During this time, Berdella drugged and held him captive in his basement. For a moment, Berdella had actually changed his mind about keeping him and took him to the doctor to treat his injuries. Shortly after this, he changed his mind again and returned him to the basement, where he eventually died. His next victim was Mark Wallace. Mark Wallace had actually been hiding in his shed to hide from a storm. Wallace had actually worked for Berdella on his yard for a little bit. While he was hiding in the shed from the storm, Berdella had invited him into his house, and then he drugged him and held him captive. After a few hours of being tortured, Wallace was eventually killed. James Ferris was his next victim. Berdella had met Ferris at a bar and invited him home. Berdella had kept Ferris as his captive for several weeks, and during this time he was also tortured and then eventually killed. Todd Stoops was another male prostitute that Berdella had known. Berdella had lured him to his house and held him captive for roughly 6 weeks. Again, Todd Stoops also died. His next victim was Larry Pearson. Berdella had actually bailed him out of jail and then held him captive in his basement for 6 weeks. During this time, Larry Pearson had actually trained himself to sleep without moving in order to avoid antagonizing Berdella to avoid more torture. After 6 weeks, Berdella bludgeoned him and suffocated him with a bag and ligature, resulting in his death. Berdella's final victim was Chris Bryson. Chris Bryson was also a male prostitute. Berdella had actually abducted him, which was a little bit different from his previous victims, whom he had lured to his house. Berdella kept him in his basement, and shortly after a few days of acting like an obedient sex slave, Bryson was given the opportunity to escape. Bryson was able to escape by jumping out of the second-story window. As soon as he got to the ground, he then ran to a neighbor's house only wearing a dog collar. This then provoked the neighbor to call the police, which leads up to Berdella's arrest. Berdella was arrested on April 2nd, 1988. Like I had stated before, this was after Bryson had escaped and gone to a neighbor's house, where they then called the cops. Berdella was then picked up and his house was searched. During this search, police had found 200 photos of Berdella's victims. All of them had shown the victims either being tortured or after being sedated with drugs. They had also found his torture log describing the different methods of torture that he had chosen to use. After these discoveries, Berdella was then given 7 counts of sodomy, 1 count of felonious restraint, and 1 count of first-degree assault, with the bail of $500,000. The next day, this had actually been revoked after an officer testified that one of the men in Berdella's photographs appeared to be dead. This gentleman was seen to be trussed up and hanging by his heels. This led to the police doing a further search of Berdella's house. When doing this, they actually found a human skull in his backyard buried, and they also found another skull in his closet. Because of the suspicion of homicides, they had actually started to look back on missing persons that were reported dating back to 1984. Berdella was sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole, and he died in 1992 of a heart attack at the Jefferson City Correctional Center.